I remember the night as if it were painted in the colors of an old master's palette, with the hues of success and the shades of pride. The auditorium was draped in a solemn darkness, pierced only by the spotlight that was to embrace my wife, Agatha, on stage. Her violin, a Stradivarius, lay waiting like a lover in the arms of its stand, its varnish reflecting the golden light. I sat in the front row, my heart swelling with pride. Agatha, with her hair swept back in an elegant chignon, her gown a river of black silk, was the epitome of grace. She was not just my wife. She was the town's beloved violinist, a maestro of the strings whose performances could stir the coldest of hearts. As she began to play, the first notes of Vivaldi's Winter floated through the air, a crisp, clear melody that seemed to slice through the very fabric of the night. I watched her, completely absorbed in her art, her bow moving with a precision that was both mechanical and deeply emotional. The audience was spellbound, the silence between notes filled with the collective breath of hundreds. I felt a surge of love, not just for the woman I married, but for the artist she had become. The concert ended with a standing ovation, the applause a thunderous acknowledgement of her talent. I stood, clapping louder than anyone, my smile as wide as the stage itself. As I made my way backstage, my mind was already on the simple dinner we had planned, a moment of normalcy after this grandeur. But life, as I would soon discover, has its own script, one that doesn't always align with our expectations. The night was still young when we returned home, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. We had decided on a quiet evening, just the two of us, to unwind from the adrenaline of the performance. I poured us some wine, a vintage we had saved for such a special occasion, watching the ruby liquid swirl in the glasses. As Agatha excused herself to change, I noticed her phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter. It buzzed with notifications, and out of habit, I glanced at it. The screen lit up, displaying a message that seemed innocuous at first but then caught my eye. Tonight was magical. I can't wait to celebrate properly with you, just us. The message was from her manager, Clara, but the tone was far from professional. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I scrolled through more messages, each one a thread in a tapestry of deceit. Photos, messages, plans for times they were supposed to be working late, all painted a vivid picture of betrayal. My hands shook, not from anger but from a profound sense of loss. How could this be? Clara, who had been her shadow, her confidant, her closest friend, had betrayed her trust in the most intimate way. And worse, my wife, the woman I thought I knew, had reciprocated. I placed the phone back exactly as it was, the weight of the discovery anchoring me to the spot. When Agatha returned, her smile was radiant, but all I saw was the mask of duplicity. I managed a weak smile, my mind racing. How long had this been going on? How could I have been so blind? We ate in silence, or at least what I perceived as silence, my thoughts drowning out any conversation. My heart was a battlefield of emotions. Love, betrayal, hurt, and a burgeoning anger. The days following the concert were a blur, each moment stretching into an eternity of contemplation. I watched Agatha, trying to reconcile my love for her with the pain of her betrayal. She was no different in her daily life. She laughed, practiced her violin, and spoke of future performances with the same passion. But now, every gesture seemed rehearsed. Every smile felt like a performance for an audience of one me. I found myself unable to confront her, a coward in the face of my own heartbreak. Instead, I withdrew, spending more time at work or with friends, anything to avoid the truth that loomed over our lives. The house, once filled with the sweet resonance of her music, now felt hollow, the notes of her violin echoing like accusations. One evening, I returned home late, having spent hours in a bar, not for the alcohol, but for the noise that drowned out my thoughts. Agatha was in the living room, her violin cradled in her arms, practicing. The melody was beautiful, haunting, but it no longer touched me. Instead, it reminded me of the duplicity that had become our life soundtrack. I watched her from the doorway, her focus absolute, her fingers dancing on the strings with a lover's intimacy. It was then I realized that her art was not just her passion but her escape, perhaps even from me, from us. The heartbreak was not just from the betrayal but from the realization that perhaps I never truly knew her. How could one share a life, a bed, a soul with someone and still be a stranger to their heart's desires? I wanted to rage, to scream, to demand answers, but instead, I retreated to our bedroom, the silence between us a chasm filled with unsaid words. Lying awake, I pondered my next move, not out of a desire for vengeance, but from a desperate need to reclaim some semblance of the life we had before it was tainted by betrayal. The night stretched on, each tick of the clock a reminder of the time we had lost, of the love that had been quietly slipping away, unnoticed until it was too late. The morning sun was unforgiving as it filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across our once-shared bedroom. I had barely slept, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and plotting. I needed to act not out of vengeance, but from a need to understand, to possibly heal. First, I had to confirm my suspicions without confrontation. I began by subtly observing Agatha's interactions with Clara. They were still the picture of professionalism, discussing upcoming events, music choices, but there was an undercurrent, a glance too long, a touch on the arm that lingered. I decided to delve deeper. I started by copying Agatha's phone data to my laptop, a breach of privacy I never thought I'd stoop to, but desperation had made me its disciple. I found more messages, more plans, not just of their affair but of how they orchestrated their time together, often at my expense. With each piece of evidence, my heart grew heavier, but my resolve grew stronger. I needed allies, someone who could help me navigate this without exploding our lives into a public spectacle. I thought of Malcolm, an old friend and a local historian, who knew everyone's secrets in this small town. I met Malcolm at our usual haunt, an old bookstore with a coffee shop attached. Over the smell of old paper and fresh coffee, I confided in him. He listened, his face a map of concern and empathy, before he nodded slowly. "There's a story," he started, his voice low, "about an old local legend where betrayal through music leads to one's downfall. Maybe we can use that." The seed of a plan began to form, one that would require patience, secrecy, and a touch of the theatrical. If Agatha loved her music, perhaps it could be the very tool to unveil her betrayal. Malcolm took me to the town's historical library, a place where dust seemed to hold as many secrets as the books themselves. He pulled out a heavy tome, its pages yellow with age, and flipped to a chapter on local legends. "The Tale of the Betrayed Bard," he read aloud, the title alone sending a chill down my spine. It spoke of a bard in the 18th century, renowned for his music, who discovered his beloved's infidelity with his patron. In his heartbreak, he composed a piece so haunting, so filled with his pain, that when performed, it led to the downfall of both the lover and the betrayer. "Music," Malcolm explained, "has power here, not just to entertain or soothe, but to curse or heal. If we can craft something similar, something that resonates with this story, we might draw out the truth in a way that's poetic justice." The idea was macabre, almost theatrical, but in my state of mind, it felt like the only path forward. We decided to use this legend as the backdrop for our plan. Malcolm would help me research more into the folklore, ensuring our narrative was steeped in authenticity, while I would work on how to subtly guide Agatha towards composing or performing something akin to the bard's curse. We left the library with a plan that felt more like a script for a drama than real life. But then again, what was my life now if not a twisted play? Over the next few weeks, I watched as Agatha worked on new compositions, her process always a private affair. I suggested, in what I hoped was a casual manner, that she should explore something from local folklore for her next piece. I spoke of how it could resonate with the community, deepen her connection with her audience. She seemed intrigued, her eyes lighting up with the possibility. Malcolm and I had prepared a dossier on the tale of the betrayed bard, which I left on her desk under the guise of an interesting read I thought she'd enjoy. Agatha took the bait. She began to delve into the legend, her curiosity piqued by the tragic romanticism of the story. I watched as she pieced together notes, her violin sometimes singing with sorrow, other times with an eerie calm. The music was unlike anything she had composed before. It was as if the legend was breathing through her strings, the pain of the past echoing into our present. I helped by suggesting motifs from the story, phrases from old diaries of the bard, anything to keep her on this path. Each note she played felt like a step closer to the truth, to the inevitable revelation. My heart ached with every session, knowing I was manipulating her art for a confession. But the pain of betrayal had turned me into someone strategic, someone who saw this composition not just as music, but as a mirror to our fractured lives. As the piece took shape, I could sense the tension, the music itself whispering of secrets and betrayals, of love turned sour. It was as if Agatha, through her music, was unknowingly narrating her own story of infidelity. And I, her once devoted husband, was now the composer of her downfall. The day of the performance arrived under a sky that was unusually overcast, as if nature itself was preparing for the drama about to unfold. The town hall was chosen for this special event, its acoustics renowned for enhancing the emotional depth of music. Agatha had decided to premiere her new piece, inspired by the tale of the betrayed bard, here in this intimate setting where the community could feel every note's weight. I stood backstage, my heart racing with a mix of dread and anticipation. The hall was filled to capacity, the buzz of excited whispers a stark contrast to the storm brewing within me. Agatha, in her black velvet gown, seemed almost ethereal, her violin now more than an instrument. It was a weapon of revelation. As she stepped onto the stage, the crowd hushed, all eyes on her. She began with a gentle melody, lulling everyone into a false sense of serenity. But slowly, the music shifted, becoming darker, more intense, each note a step closer to unveiling the truth. I had arranged for Malcolm to be in the audience, his understanding of the legend and its implications adding a layer of depth to the performance. He was to subtly nod or gesture if he felt the music was hitting the right notes of betrayal and sorrow. The piece climaxed with a series of haunting, repetitive notes, each one seeming to echo the cries of the betrayed bard from centuries ago. It was then that I slipped into the audience, taking my seat beside Clara, who was under the impression this was just another concert. As the final note lingered, a silence fell over the room, a silence that was pregnant with the unspoken. Then, Agatha spoke, her voice clear, almost detached, explaining the inspiration behind her composition. She described the bard's pain, the betrayal, the music as a form of cathartic revenge. The air changed. Whispers turned into murmurs as the audience began to connect the dots. Malcolm's presence, his nodding, his whispered explanations to those around him, all part of our plan, were now in motion. The story, our story, was being told through her music, and the audience was piecing together the narrative of our personal tragedy. The applause was hesitant at first, then louder, but it carried a different weight. It wasn't just for the music. It was for the story behind it. People were looking at Agatha, at Clara, at me with questions in their eyes. The performance had ended, but the real show was just beginning. I stood, making my way to the stage, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. "Thank you, Agatha," I said, my voice echoing through the hall, "for such a moving piece. It's interesting how art can sometimes mirror life, isn't it?" The room grew silent once more, the tension palpable. I continued, "This piece, inspired by betrayal, resonates deeply with many, perhaps even with some of us here tonight." Clara's face was a mask of confusion turning into realization. Agatha looked at me, her eyes wide, perhaps beginning to understand the depth of my involvement in this narrative. I turned to the audience. "I'd like to thank my wife, not just for her music, but for giving us all a glimpse into the truth behind the melody." My words were a catalyst, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place for everyone present. Whispers turned into open conversation. Questions were thrown at Clara and Agatha. The betrayal wasn't just between us. It was now public, a spectacle for the town to digest. Malcolm moved among the crowd, further explaining the legend, tying it to the present moment, ensuring the narrative we crafted would stick. The days following the performance were filled with a strange, oppressive atmosphere. The town, small as it was, buzzed with gossip, and the legend of the betrayed bard seemed to take on a life of its own. People began to notice odd occurrences. Clara's car wouldn't start, windows shattered unexpectedly in her home, and her career opportunities dried up overnight. For Agatha, the music that once brought her acclaim now seemed to haunt her. She couldn't play without the piece echoing back, as if the instrument itself was cursed with the tale she had woven into its strings. Her performances were now met with whispers, not of awe, but of scandal. I watched these events unfold from a distance, part of me feeling a grim satisfaction, another part horrified at what we had unleashed. The legend, meant as a metaphor, was manifesting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Malcolm had warned me about the power of belief in this town, how stories could become reality if the community willed it so. Now I saw it firsthand. The curse wasn't just a narrative, it was becoming our reality. Agatha tried to confront me, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice a mix of accusation and plea. I had no answer, for I myself was caught in the web we had spun. The town's reaction was the final stroke of our plan, turning the legend into a living, breathing entity that affected everyone involved. No one could escape the shadow of the betrayed bard now. His story had become our story, and its echoes were felt far beyond the music. The fallout from the performance was swift and merciless. Clara was the first to feel the full brunt of the town's disdain. Her business ventures crumbled, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. The whispers that once followed her in admiration now trailed her like a dark cloud of scandal. She lost clients, friends, and any semblance of normalcy. Invitations dried up, and her once bustling office became a lonely echo chamber of her past successes. Agatha, on the other hand, was met with a more complex reaction. There was still admiration for her talent, but it was tainted now. Her concerts were sparsely attended, the audience more curious about the drama than the music. The violin, once her voice to the world, now seemed to speak only of betrayal and revenge. She was invited to fewer and fewer prestigious events, her name whispered not with reverence but with a mix of pity and morbid curiosity. I had not anticipated the depth of the social and professional isolation they would face. Watching Agatha struggle with her music, seeing the light in her eyes dim, was a victory that tasted more of ash than triumph. The curse of the bard, or perhaps just the weight of public opinion, was reshaping their lives in ways that were far more punishing than I had intended. I found myself questioning my role in all of this. Had I orchestrated a downfall or unleashed a storm that no one could control? The line between justice and cruelty blurred in the harsh reality of their lives post-performance. The isolation was palpable. Agatha and Clara, once the heart of our social circle, were now its pariahs. Clara moved out of town, seeking solace away from the judgmental eyes that now followed her everywhere. Her departure was quiet, almost secretive, as if she was fleeing not just the place but the very narrative we had woven around her. Agatha, however, chose to stay, perhaps out of pride or a stubborn refusal to let this be the end of her career. But staying meant enduring the silent treatments, the cold shoulders, and the whispers that seemed to chase her through the streets. Her performances were now small, private affairs, held in obscure venues where the audience was more about support than spectacle. I watched from a distance, my heart heavy with the realization of what had become of our lives. The house, once filled with laughter and music, was now a place of solitude for Agatha. I had moved out, unable to live in the remnants of what our marriage had been. Yet I couldn't fully detach myself from watching the consequences of our actions unfold. The town, in its own way, had exacted a revenge that went beyond my initial plan. The legend had become folklore again, a cautionary tale now told with real names and faces. The isolation was not just physical but emotional, stripping away the connections that once defined their lives. Months had passed since the fateful performance, and the town had begun to move on. But the story lingered like an old song you can't forget. Agatha, in an act of defiance or perhaps desperation, planned one final concert. She announced it would be her last, her swan song, where she would play her new compositions, including variations on the piece that had started it all. The venue was outside, in the town square, where the air would carry her music far and wide, perhaps as one last act of reclaiming her narrative. I decided to attend, not as a husband or an ex, but as a witness to the end of an era. The night was clear, the stars above offering a silent commentary on the human drama below. Agatha stood alone, her violin case on the ground, her instrument ready to sing its last song under her touch. There was a small crowd, those who either felt loyalty or curiosity. She played with a ferocity, a passion that seemed to be her pouring out everything she had left. The music was raw, emotional, weaving through the night air, touching everyone who listened. Her final piece was a new interpretation of the betrayed bard's melody. But this time, it ended not in sorrow but in a crescendo of acceptance and perhaps forgiveness. As the last note faded into the night, there was a moment of profound silence, then applause, genuine and heartfelt. It was as if the music had lifted a curse, not just from Agatha but from all of us. She took a bow, her eyes meeting mine for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. That night, under the stars, I realized the true power of music, to heal, to forgive, to end cycles of revenge. Agatha's final performance wasn't just the end of her career but perhaps the beginning of her healing, of all our healing. After Agatha's final performance, the town seemed to exhale, as if a long-held breath was finally released. The whispers about the scandal had not vanished, but they had lost their sharp edge, becoming part of the tapestry of local lore rather than daily gossip. The legend of the betrayed bard had been put to rest, its echo now a reminder of the power of stories, music, and human fragility. Agatha sold our house, the one filled with memories both sweet and bitter, and moved into a smaller, more modest place. She withdrew from public performances, choosing instead to teach music to children, passing on her knowledge and love for the art without the burden of fame or scandal. Her life became quieter, but there was a peace in her solitude that hadn't been there before. I, on the other hand, found myself adrift. The plan for revenge, once executed, left me with a void where my anger and hurt had been. I began to volunteer at local charities, seeking a new purpose, trying to fill my days with something more than the remnants of my past life. I saw Agatha less, our interactions brief and polite, as if we were both too aware of the weight of our shared history. The town, which had once been a stage for our drama, continued to live and grow, the story of us fading into the background. But the lessons learned, the pain endured, shaped how people viewed relationships, art, and the thin line between justice and revenge. Years passed, and the story of Agatha, Clara, and myself became less about scandal and more about a local legend. It was often recounted by Malcolm during his history tours, a tale of caution, love, betrayal, and redemption, wrapped in the mythos of the betrayed bard. The new generation of townsfolk knew the story not as a real event but as part of the folklore that made our town unique. It was taught in schools, not as history but as a moral tale, emphasizing the consequences of actions driven by emotion rather than wisdom. Agatha, now grayer and more serene, occasionally attended these storytelling sessions, sitting at the back with a subtle smile. Her presence was a silent testament to the complexity of human emotions, her music no longer a weapon, but a bridge to understanding and peace. I, too, found myself at these events occasionally, listening to our story being told through the filter of time and myth. It was strange to hear our personal tragedy turned into something educational, almost mythical. But in these retellings, I saw the possibility of healing, not just for Agatha and me but for anyone who heard the story. The final chapter of our story was written not in anger or revenge but in the quiet moments of reflection and growth. Agatha's legacy as a musician was redefined. She was remembered not just for her scandal but for her resilience, her ability to transform pain into something beautiful. I took up writing, documenting our story from my perspective, not to reignite old flames of betrayal but to offer insights into human nature. The book became a local success, often used in discussions about art, ethics, and personal redemption. It was my way of dealing with the past, turning my narrative into something constructive rather than destructive. Clara, though she never returned to the town, sent word through mutual friends that she had rebuilt her life elsewhere, finding new success and perhaps happiness. Her story, once intertwined with ours, diverged into its own path, a reminder that even in the darkest narratives, there's a chance for new beginnings. In the end, what remained was not the pain or the betrayal, but the understanding that every story, no matter how dark, has the potential to teach, to heal, and to echo through time as a lesson rather than a lament. Our lives, once shattered by the weight of vengeance, were now part of a larger tapestry, teaching those who came after us about the power of forgiveness, the complexity of love, and the enduring legacy of art.